My name is Mikhail Voronin. I am 34 years old. I was trained as a geologist, but I have spent most of my life not with instruments, but with reports. People describe me as calm under pressure. That is true. I am the kind of person who can keep taking notes even during moments of panic. That is why I was chosen for this expedition. That is why, when there were no survivors, the only coherent account left behind was my notebook. I am not writing this as a confession. At least that was not my intention when I began. I am writing these lines for the details that would never make it into official reports, because some things could not be measured. Some things were never recorded, but they happened. The day we set out, the sky was overcast. Snow was falling, but not heavily enough to affect visibility. There were 9 of us, all experienced. We had taken on more difficult routes, endured harsher storms. No one was uneasy. Throughout the first day, our conversations were ordinary. Distance, pace, the tea we would drink at the next break. None of us knew that in a few days we would realize how much of a luxury those conversations were. The first night, when we set up camp, everything was normal. The tents were properly pitched, the lines tight, the supplies organized. Alexei, our leader, did his usual final inspection. "No mistakes," he said. "These mountains don't forgive them." He smiled. No one responded, but the smile spread anyway. As I fell asleep that night, the only thing on my mind was waking early and continuing without losing the route. I woke several times during the night, not from the cold, not from the wind. At the time, I couldn't identify why I woke up. It wasn't like being shaken awake, more like there was something I was supposed to be waiting for. I checked my watch, 2:10 a.m. A few minutes later, I fell back asleep. I didn't write it down. I thought it was insignificant. The second day, the weather changed. The temperature dropped, but the real difference was the wind. It was irregular. Sometimes it stopped completely, then suddenly surged. The sound it made against the tent fabric had taken on something almost rhythmic. That disturbed me, because wind doesn't usually behave like that. At least, not so inconsistently. In the afternoon, Irina complained of a headache. Yuri said he felt nauseous. We attributed it to the cold and exhaustion. We had to. Looking for another explanation would have meant damaging morale. The group was still organized, but conversations had shortened. No one was joking anymore. It was a subtle but important change. The second night, we pitched camp on a slope more exposed to the wind. The alternatives were worse. Alexei was confident in his decision. When I entered the tent, I felt a slight pressure in my ears. That can happen at high altitude. Still, I noted it down, because the pressure wasn't limited to my ears. I felt it in my chest as well. I tried to sleep. I couldn't. Around 2 a.m., I noticed a sound coming from outside. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't an animal. It was more like the distant hum of an engine, but not constant. It came in waves. It passed through the thin walls of the tent and echoed inside me. I put my head in my hands. It could have been a hallucination. Cold, fatigue, lack of sleep, all of it was possible. But then I heard movement from the neighboring tent, the sudden tension of fabric, the familiar sound of someone sitting upright, then rapid breathing, not a scream. A suppressed sound of panic. Alexei's voice followed. "Everyone stay calm." At that moment, I wrote this in my notebook. "The group is still under control. But for the first time, no one is asking what's happening, because we all knew we were feeling the same thing, and if we named it, it would become real. Just before dawn, the wind stopped suddenly. This was not the kind of silence that belongs in the mountains. It was too dense, too smooth. When I stepped outside, I noticed something strange in the snow. Footprints. They weren't different from ours, but their direction was irregular, as if someone had started toward a point, then changed their mind, then tried again. No one admitted to leaving the tent during the night. From this point on, I know what I write will not be accepted as a report, but I am writing it anyway, because as we entered the third night, we were all thinking the same thing, and no one said it out loud. Something is wrong here, and whatever it is, it was here before us. On the morning of the third day, no one said, "I slept well." In fact, no one described how they slept at all. We simply moved more slowly. Gloves went on later. Ropes took longer to tie. Simple tasks stretched unnecessarily. I was aware of it, yet I still wrote fatigue in my notebook, because I didn't want to choose another word. Alexei reviewed the route. We could still reach our objective. It wasn't too late to turn back, but moving forward was still possible. Most of the group favored continuing. This had nothing to do with courage. We knew turning back would be harder. Retracing our steps, with the wind increasing, would be more dangerous. That was the logical choice. And in these mountains, logical decisions were the most dangerous ones. As we walked, the wind started again, but it was no longer irregular. It wasn't coming from a single direction. It felt as though it was moving around us. This wasn't something measurable, yet we all walked the same way, turned our heads at the same moments. At one point, Yuri stopped and asked, "Do you hear that?" No one answered, because we couldn't say what it was we were hearing. The sound wasn't perceived by the ears, but by the body. A faint vibration in the chest. Nausea, a sense of unease without a cause. Irina said her head hurt again. This time her voice was weaker. Alexei called for a break. We sat down. No one spoke. The silence was more disturbing than the wind, because within it the vibration was clearer. By afternoon, we reached the slope where we would camp. It wasn't ideal, but it was acceptable. Searching for a more sheltered area would have cost us time. Alexei made his decision. The tents went up. Everything was orderly again, but order no longer felt reassuring. It felt like we were simply following habit, obeying rules to delay something. Before nightfall, I wrote a few technical notes in my notebook. Wind speed, estimated temperature. Then I paused, because what I wanted to write wasn't technical. What I wanted to write was, "I don't want to be here." I didn't write that. Instead, I wrote psychological fatigue. When night fell, the sound returned, this time stronger. The metal equipment inside the tent vibrated slightly. That wasn't possible. Wind doesn't cause that. Still, no one went outside, because we knew outside would be worse. Or at least we thought we did. I checked my watch. 1:47 a.m. Sudden movement came from the neighboring tent. Then the sound of fabric straining. Someone was pulling at the zipper from inside. Alexei's voice rose. "Stop. Calm down." There was no reply, only breathing, fast, uncontrolled. Then the rhythm of the sound changed. It became more regular, as if someone had pressed a switch. The pressure in my chest increased. I tried to think rationally. A panic attack, infrasound, low-frequency vibrations caused by wind over the slope. All of this existed in the literature, but the literature did not explain what I felt in that moment, the urge to go outside. That urge wasn't born of fear. On the contrary, it felt like a solution. The inside of the tent felt constricting. Breathing was difficult. If I went outside, I would feel relief. When I realized this thought wasn't entirely my own, it was already too late. I heard a tent tear. The sound merged with the ripping of fabric. Someone went outside, then another. There were no screams, no commands, only urgency. Alexei was shouting, but his words were indistinct. It was as if the sound was smothering speech. I couldn't stand up. My notebook slipped from my hands. My heart was beating uncontrollably. When I finally threw myself outside, what I saw burned itself into my mind. People weren't running away from the tents. They weren't heading downhill. They were walking into the mountain. Irregularly, not running, but without stopping. They had no boots, no jackets. This wasn't a panicked escape. This was movement with purpose. At that moment, the sound stopped. In its place came a silence so absolute it was deafening. Within it, I could only hear my own breathing and the thin layers of ice breaking beneath the snow. I shouted. I called their names. No one turned back. I didn't search for them until morning. I couldn't, because I wasn't sure there would be a morning. I returned to the tent. Inside, everything was in disarray. The tears were from the inside outward. I made a point of noting this, because I knew the reports would ask what it meant. I wrote this in my notebook. This was not an escape. This was the right decision, made at the wrong moment. And in that moment I understood it wasn't over yet, because the sound hadn't left. It was only waiting. When morning came, I realized it not by the light, but by the sound. The wind had returned. The heavy silence of the night was gone. The mountain was behaving normally again. This didn't comfort me. On the contrary, it filled me with deep unease, because it made me think that what happened during the night was not part of the mountain's natural state, that the abnormality had been a brief window. When I stepped out of the tent, the cold finally made itself felt. My fingers were numb, my breathing was uneven, but my mind was strangely clear. I saw the footprints. It hadn't snowed during the night. They were distinct. All of them led in the same direction, not downhill, deeper in, toward a more exposed area. I began searching. The first one I found was Irina. She was lying on her side at the base of a tree. She wore only a thin thermal layer. Her feet were bare. There was no fear on her face. That detail rooted me in place. Hypothermia can sometimes calm a person. I knew that. But this calm, this didn't look like someone who died while fleeing. It looked like someone who had stopped. A little farther on, I found Yuri. His hands were frozen near his face, as if trying to shield himself from something. But from what? There was nothing around him. I couldn't find his notebook. That didn't make it into the reports, because writing missing item was easy. No one asked why it was missing. We found the others farther down. Yes, because a few hours later the search teams arrived. Our deviation from the planned route and our delayed return had been noticed. The rescue team was disciplined, professional, but I will never forget the expressions on their faces when they saw the condition of the tents, the tiers, from the inside out. That detail caught their attention too. Official reports were prepared. Hypothermia, severe weather, panic. These words were used again and again. They were all partly true, but incomplete, because the reports didn't explain the moments of decision. Why did no one put on their boots? Why wasn't there an orderly evacuation of the tent? Why didn't the footprints follow a logical escape route? While reviewing the autopsy reports, one doctor spoke to me in a whisper. "There's internal bleeding in some of them," he said, "but no external signs of trauma." He lowered his voice further, as if they were exposed to an immense pressure. "Avalanche?" I asked. He shook his head. "No avalanche signs." That conversation didn't make it into the report either. I survived, not because of courage, not because of knowledge, most likely chance, or a delay in how the sound affected me. I will never know. All I know is this: that night we all acted rationally. The pressure inside the tent, the panic, the inability to breathe, everything made going outside feel like the right choice, the right decision, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Months later, the case was closed. The files were shelved. The public was told it was unexplainable but natural. That phrase comforted people, because the word natural suggests something controllable. I learned to fear the things that are uncontrollable, yet still part of nature. Before closing my final notebook, I write this: what killed us wasn't a monster. It wasn't a storm. What killed us was the human mind betraying itself under the right conditions. And yet, sometimes at night when I hear the wind blow at a certain tone, I feel that old pressure in my chest. My reason can explain it, but a small part of me still whispers the same possibility. What if that wasn't all? Time flows differently at the top of the world. Hours stretch, breath shortens, thoughts grow heavy. On Everest, everyone knows the same truth. Not everyone who reaches the summit will come back down, and even those who know this push the thought away once they're up there, because the idea of turning back weighs more than dreams. On the morning of May 10th, at the final camp on the South Ridge, the weather was almost deceptive. The sky was clear, the wind light. It was as if the mountain had decided not to bare its teeth for a single day. The guides called this silence a gift, but among the climbers another word was whispered: trap. They set out at 1:30 a.m., headlamps cut through the darkness, their beams moving across the snow like trembling ghosts. With every step, metal crampons spoke to the ice, and that conversation echoed through the night. The rasping breaths inside the oxygen masks felt like the last thing separating humans from machines. Marco was near the back of the group. He was an experienced climber, but for the first time he felt, with absolute clarity, that Everest was something else entirely. He knew high altitude played tricks on the brain, and yet sometimes he felt as if someone were walking behind him. When he turned around, there was nothing but snow and ropes. As the hours passed, the pace slowed. They were running too late to reach the summit safely. The guide shouted over the radio, 2 p.m. turnaround time. Anyone not at the summit turns back, but no one wanted to turn back. The summit was only a few hundred meters away now. At this point, the human mind doesn't calculate, it gambles. A little more oxygen, a little more strength, a little more luck. At 3:40 p.m., the first climber reached the summit. Photos were taken, flags unfurled. Even on frozen faces, the smiles were visible. Then the wind suddenly shifted. First a low hum, then a piercing scream that tore through the air. The sky darkened and it began. Snow fell sideways. Visibility dropped to just a few meters. The ropes disappeared. Any sense of direction dissolved. Every minute spent near the summit now carried a price. On the descent, the first oxygen tank ran empty. Then another. The breath inside the mask gradually lost its warmth. The cold seeped not just into skin, but into thoughts. At one point, Marco stopped. Someone was in front of him. A climber, motionless, kneeling, head slumped forward. When Marco touched him to help, he felt a shoulder as hard as stone beneath the glove. But what was truly horrifying was the man's expression. He was smiling. As the storm intensified, the radios went silent. Guides shouted names that vanished into the darkness. People followed the wrong ropes. Some decided to sit down and rest. On Everest, that decision is a final one. When night fell, the mountain swallowed them completely, and Marco knew he was no longer alone. Because within the roar of the storm, he heard a whisper that sounded like a human voice. The summit is so close. Night on Everest is not a time of day. Night is a moment of judgment. When Marco could no longer feel his fingers inside his gloves, he understood that. The cold wasn't slipping under his skin, it was seeping between his thoughts. The rasp from his oxygen mask had weakened. Each breath felt like air being dragged by force through a metal mouth. He knew he couldn't stop. On Everest, stopping doesn't kill the body, it kills the will. But with every step, direction became more uncertain. The ropes were gone. The tracks he'd followed before had vanished. With the storm, the mountain had reclaimed the route. The radio crackled for a brief moment. The time has passed. It wasn't a warning, it was a statement. In the darkness, Marco saw shapes moving. At first, he thought it was an illusion. Then he realized they were sitting still, 8 people, side by side, facing into the wind. Their faces were frozen, but their expressions were calm. These were not the faces of people trying to escape, but of those who had chosen to stay. One of them lifted his head. His eyes were open. He wasn't alive, but he wasn't empty either. "You missed the turnaround time," he said. Marco tried to step back. His knees trembled. He lost his balance and collapsed. His hand grabbed something solid beneath the snow. An arm, human. The man's face was familiar. He had passed him earlier that day. Now his lips moved, but no sound came out. The words appeared directly in Marco's mind. Reaching the summit is not enough. The wind rose. Snow closed in from all sides. And in that moment, Marco understood. Everest didn't kill people. It sealed the wrong decision. He remembered the guide's voice. 2 p.m. turnaround time. But the summit had been so close. Just a little more. Only a little more. That was a mistake. Marco stood up. He didn't look down. He looked up. Police? West? The summit was a vague shape in the darkness, but it was there. And strangely, it no longer frightened him. He removed his oxygen mask. The cold burned his lungs. For the first time, his mind was clear. "I'm not turning back," he said. The mountain didn't answer, but the wind stopped. When morning came, the sky was clear. Rescue teams found 8 bodies, all of them frozen just a few meters from the descent route. Official reports were written. Causes were listed. Times, errors, weather conditions were documented. Marco was listed as missing. Months later, a new team stopped near the summit. The weather was calm. As they prepared to take photos, they saw a figure standing ahead, almost as if it were showing the way. As they approached, their breath caught. The figure was wearing an oxygen mask. Behind the mask's glass, there were no eyes, only darkness. On the chest of the jacket was a name tag, Marco. Beside him stood a small block of ice, like a signpost. The wind had brushed the snow away, revealing a single sentence beneath it. No one knew who had written it. Those who arrive late at the summit do not return. Everest was silent. It was not undecided. It did not take back its judgment, because the mountain does not forgive haste, and it never releases a summit taken against its will.